You're listening to an exclusive episode of the NK News podcast, available only to subscribers. You can listen to this and other episodes from your preferred podcast player by accessing the private podcast feed. For more detailed instructions, please see the step-by-step guide on the NK News website at nknews.org/private-feed. Hello listeners and welcome to the NK News podcast. I'm your host, Jacko Zwetsloot, and this episode is being recorded on Thursday the 18th of September in the NK News studio here in downtown Seoul, and I'm joined today by two first-time guests. First of all, we've got Tony Bard, who is editor of the London Philatelist and a member of the Royal Philatelic Society London. He collects North and South Korean postal history from 1945 with a focus on Korean War material and post-Armistice commissions, and holds several original North-South exchange letters. Meanwhile, JiHoon Suk is a Korean historian completing his Ph.D. at Yonsei University, specializing in early modern Korean history. He provides historical context and linguistic guidance in today's conversation and has located original film footage of something that we're going to be talking about, which is the little-known inter-Korean postal exchange that ran between the period of liberation, 1945, and the outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950. We're going to talk about how it worked, why it existed, where and when such exchanges took place, and also why it's never resumed since 1950. So, Tony, JiHoon, welcome on the NK News podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, I guess we'll start with a sort of a scene-setting question, just to kind of get the topic out there and hopefully get the listeners hooked. So before the shooting started in June 1950, letters continued to cross the 38th parallel every week. Families, courts, offices, even propaganda bureaus talking by mail with each other. If you had to convince a skeptical listener in 1 minute that this exchange was real and that it was important, that it mattered, what one item or scene would you choose? I'll have Tony, you start first.
That's a very good question. My sort of knowledge of this period is from reading, apart from actually having a reasonable number of items that went through the exchange, is reading the reports of the censors in Seoul. Mm-hmm. And basically their job was to try and ensure that pro-Soviet, pro-North Korean propaganda didn't filter through, and also to prevent transactions of any real value.
So no cross-border remittances of money. Okay.
No.
And they were. You say they were censoring material coming from the north into
Correct.
the south to make sure that nothing praiseworthy of Kim Il-sung would come through.
But essentially, I mean, and whether I don't necessarily think that on every occasion they prevented the letters being delivered, but they would put people on a watch list.
Right. Okay.
The difficulty is we have very little to go by on the items going the other way, because despite the fact that the vast majority of mail that went through these exchanges was actually from the south to the north, whereas material coming from the north is, it's not common, but it's not that rare.
Yeah.
There are only 4 known examples of mail going from the south to the north that appear to have survived. So I have if you ask the question, I mean, I have a postcard going to the north, and naturally there's not going to be anything written on the back that's going to be too either revealing or cause any censors to look at, but was censored by the South Korean authorities. And effectively, it's a fairly mundane.
Wait, censored by the South Korean authorities before it was sent into the north? Okay.
Correct, yeah. And it's the only example I've actually seen where that's been done, but I'm presuming that a significant number were examined. And it's a very mundane message, which is basically you make sure you get a job in Pyongyang so you can earn some money.
Wow.
So
a relative to it?
Yeah. So, I mean, it just shows that sort of, even with the separation, there was a commonality between normal people.
Well, of course, I mean, at that time, nobody thought this would last forever, right?
Correct. Correct.
Or 80 years. Anyway, JiHoon, how would you answer that question? How would you convince a skeptical listener that this mail exchange was real and that it was important?
Well, first of all, starting in January 1946, when the Soviets and the U.S. started to have the talk, they of course
is the U.S.-Soviet Joint Commission.
Joint Commissions in January 1946. They started working on 5 crucial issues, as they call it, be it including exchanges of people and communications and all that sort of thing, but nothing. Almost nothing was coming out of that. They couldn't reach into the agreement. But then the only thing they could actually reach an agreement was the exchange of letters. So this is probably the only thing in the larger context, historical context. The only thing that literally that actually came out from the Joint Commission.
Right.
And it actually continued well into the 1950. I think the last exchange happened in 3 days before before the war began.
3 days before.
Yeah, we'll come
June
to that.
22nd.
Yes.
But so, that's, so.
And of course, there was a huge backlog in both Seoul and
By this
Pyongyang.
point,
Right,
yes.
because by the time they started, it had been more than 6 months that there'd be no exchange going across. Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
That US-Soviet Joint Commission, by the way, took place very close to here in one of the buildings in the Doksugung Palace, really just around the corner. Okay. So we know that the exchange started in early 1946, and it began just a couple of days before the Korean War broke out. So how regular was it?
Oh, it stopped, yes. How regular? Well, initially it was it was going to be, I think the original plan was monthly. That then changed to every 2 weeks, and ultimately was weekly. There was a big gap in the middle of 46 because of a cholera. Big gap in the middle of 46 because of a cholera outbreak.
Where, on what side of the parallel?
On the north.
On the north side. Okay.
Yeah. And that lasted up until, I think, October of 46. So there's another backlog. And in general, it was carried out pretty straightforwardly. The first exchange took place at Kaesong railway station.
So it was done by train?
The train.
These are not truckloads of mail.
Always the train.
Always the train.
And always a performance in terms of getting clearance from the Soviets to cross the 38th parallel, and delays and occasional gunfire and problems, which is all sort of covered in various letters between Hodge and Stikov, who was the Soviet,
military commanders.
Yep. But it still tended to go ahead pretty reasonably. But the second and subsequent exchanges were moved to Yohyeon because
That's another station.
And further in the north. Yeah, it was further into the north. Because the North Koreans didn't think that it was good for North Koreans to see the flesh pots of South Korea compared to what they had at home. Like Kaesong Railroad Station was the Vegas of the 38th parallel.
At that time, for our listeners who may not be aware, at that time, Kaesong was a city on the southern side of the 30th parallel. That changed hands during the war.
Yeah.
And so when was the change made from Kaesong Station to Yohyeon?
The second exchange.
Well, at that time, there was not yet a government of North Korea, so it might have been the Soviets who made that decision, no?
Undoubtedly.
Yeah.
Undoubtedly. Yeah.
Okay, so initially monthly, then fortnightly or every 2 weeks, and then weekly.
Yeah, it became very relaxed actually as in the actual workings, bar normal things like trains getting derailed or bad weather or cholera. The sort of things that had nothing to do with the political side of things.
On a related note, I guess I remember reading. I think it might have been in an issue of the National Geographic magazine in 1946 or 47, and it was the journalist was following a convoy of American trucks going from Seoul to somewhere on the Ongjin Peninsula. It might have been Haeju. Sorry, not Haeju, but it was somewhere on the Ongjin Peninsula. But to get there, they had to drive the trucks north of the 30th parallel into Soviet-controlled territory because of the way that it's cut off by water. So it was an island. Yeah. So they had to drive into the north and then drive into the south. And every time they had to send a note to the Soviets beforehand, on this day, at this time, there'll be 46 trucks those trucks will be driven by these men, those trucks will be carrying these things, and if one of those things was wrong, then the whole convoy would be stopped and there'd be a whole inspection. Why, why is this truck not here? And or why is the driver changed or something like that? So,
spot on.
I mentioned that because you said that there was quite a performative or performance.
A lot of the equivalent happened with every single train.
Right.
That it was down to how many guards are going to be on it, how many soldiers from the American side. Americans weren't that bothered as far as what the Russians were doing, to be honest. But they were much more focused on getting the mail out. But they had to sort of follow procedure, which was a Soviet standard procedure, and there could always be something which they would find to complain about, indubitably. But in general, it worked really well. And of course, the other thing that's relevant from the postal history point of view, if you like, is that both countries issued their own stamps just after the first exchange began.
So before the first exchange,
Japanese,
until the first exchange, they're using Japanese stamps.
So all that mail that was backed up.
Yeah.
Seoul had 800 sacks of mail.
Oh, of course, because people were sending they were posting these letters.
There was no prohibition on actually posting the things.
They just weren't going to where they went.
Yeah.
Okay. And so they were using Japanese stamps, and then after that first exchange,
the first two exchanges were all Japanese franc mail.
Okay. And then the Soviets issued some stamps in the north, the Americans in the south.
Exactly.
And that's when we see. Interesting.
Yeah. And you get lots of, I've never actually seen it, but when you look at the censor reports, they mention propaganda caches on the northern mail.
Just for the listeners who are not familiar with philately, what's a cache?
A cache is like it's a sort of postmark, but it doesn't have a date on it. It'll have a slogan or just wording. Yeah.
Okay, so this might be those who are old enough to remember real letters. This might be an envelope could have a thing. Obviously, it's got the postmark above the stamp, and then somewhere else on the envelope there might be a commemorative stamp saying, 10 years since liberation, or
absolutely
we commemorate the birthday of the great leader, or something like that.
Absolutely,
it's a non-postal stamp that's been put on a piece of mail. That's a cache. Okay, yeah. All right, JiHoon, now later on we've got contemporary press and official translations note these weekly exchanges, these Thursday exchanges, and they count well over 150 runs by May 1950. Tell us a bit more about the Korean sources, what they say about the frequency and about the mail.
It's really, I don't really need to add much because, again, like most Korean historians don't really mention much of it at all. Even though it was, like I said, was one of the only, probably the only thing that was actually
the only positive result,
and actual outcome that came out of the whole thing, the agreement, and even after both sides, had organized their own governments and everything, it still continued on a regular basis. That was the only thing that was actually agreed upon, but people don't really mention that much about it at all. And in fact, an average Korean people wouldn't even know that there was such a thing. Up all the way up to 3 days before.
Yes.
3 days before the war began.
Yeah.
But
So basically, unless somebody had a relative living on the other side of the 30th parallel, given the lack of newspaper articles or public advertising about it, people just wouldn't be aware.
Yeah, and I also, it's also quite interesting to point out that I did come across with, it's not exactly something that I would consider as the public opinion because it's obviously coming from a government source. But there's this publication that I can. What was the name of it? I think it was Korea Pictorial, which was published.
It's an English language.
It's an English language publication published by the information.
I think it was called the Korea International Publicity League
or something like that. Yes, and in the 1950 edition, they do talk about this kind of mail exchange thing, but then they always insist on the fact that they send so much more. The South is actually sending a lot more, 10 times more than from the very beginning of the exchanges. Then what comes out of it is way less. So they were basically saying that, of course, there are the North Koreans see what's going on. we send out all these things, like uncensored and all that, which is not true. But but then we are a freedom-loving people. But then the other side, they don't do it.
Fit in the mood music,
that sort of thing. So they just use this thing as a propaganda. But even after 1950, of course, they don't. I mean, they occasionally pointed that out up to the 50s, but. Yeah, after the 50s, I don't think the whole, no one really started to talk about it anymore. So
let me ask Tony about that. So talk a bit about that asymmetry, and you've already hinted at how your own collection of items reflects that asymmetry.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think there's the numbers were obviously noted, and I think I think there began to become a suspicion in the North about anyone who was communicating with the South. Certainly more so after the formation of the DPRK.
Which was in September 1948.
Correct. And I think that even receiving mail from a relative in the South could actually put you in trouble. And it's also going back to the publicity that the whole exchange got. You would get in the Donga Ilbo, for example, they would regularly publish the number of letters and postcards and registered letters that were exchanged on a particular date.
Just as a public information service?
Yeah, essentially. And when the next one would be. North, I've seen nothing. I've seen no reference because obviously the Americans would go through all of the North Korean newspapers and pick out anything that was deemed worthy of dissemination within the States or the U.S. Army government.
Go on.
But nothing about the mail exchange.
Curious to hear the rest? Become an NK News subscriber today for access to the full episode. Head to nknews.org/join for more information. If you're already a subscriber to NK News, you can listen to full episodes from your preferred podcast player by accessing the private podcast feed. For more detailed instructions, please see the step-by-step guide on the NK News website at nknews.org/private-feed.